Hello, everyone. Welcome back to It's a Lot, Let's Talk. I'm Kylie Cameron,
I'm JP Hatala.
and today we wanted to talk about the working caregiver. So we'll start off with the question, who is the largest caregiving workforce in Canada? It's not home care agencies, it's not hospitals, it's employees. Inside organizations, millions of working adults are quietly providing unpaid care to aging parents, to partners, to children with complex care needs, to loved ones navigating any type of illness. Most workplaces don't formally track it, but it's always there. So caregiving isn't something happening outside of work anymore. It's happening inside of it.
Yeah, and that's just the reality, right? Like I guess an organization is a microcosm of society itself. And, within society we have these, unpaid caregivers taking care of their families, taking care of whoever, but they work within an organization. So it's not only society's issues or challenges, it's become and has always been organizations. And I think that's what's really critical. I think for the most part, organizations recognize it, maybe. Maybe they don't. Maybe larger organizations do. Definitely small, to medium-sized organizations have a bit more of a challenge with that. But you would think any larger organization, corporation, has some sort of recognition or idea that this is actually going on. The demographics are changing every day. We're getting an older population, and it's just a reality. So being able to think about this, manage this is really critical if organizations want to remain productive and hold on to their talent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should start with breaking down who the working caregiver is and what that really means. So, from my perspective, usually that is someone who they don't always self-identify as a caregiver, which then does make it more difficult for these organizations to recognize
Right.
these working caregivers in their organizations. So, typically these are, I would say, mid-career employees and often high performers. Um, could be sandwich generation, meaning that they have kids that they're looking after, but they also are now navigating caring for their aging parents and quietly coordinating appointments during work hours or taking calls during work hours, whatever it is. That thought or the overwhelming feeling of aging for your parent doesn't necessarily go away just because you clocked in to work, right?
Mm.
It's still there, and that is, again, quietly affecting or could potentially quietly affect your productivity at work. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, no question. And I think it actually heightens your awareness of your situation when you're taking care of your parents and you're at work. I
mhm,
don't think it diminishes it or it goes away. In fact, heightens it because now, you're dealing almost in a situation and then you had to remove yourself temporarily to go to work. It's
mhm.
still resonating there. It's still the top of mind. And the big question becomes, how is that impacting, like you said, productivity, work, and that type of thing. And I think you mentioned one thing that was really interesting. Often, the caregivers are high performers. Why is that? And I think maybe we can unpack that a little bit and kind of explore that a little more. Caregiving is not an easy task. You think of all the skills and the competencies required to be able to do it effectively. Takes I wouldn't say higher, well, maybe even higher cognitive level of understanding, but also just being able to kind of put it all together. And typically that reflects the individual in a work situation. So if you were to go into an organization and you were to say, okay, if I had to guess, who the caregivers are, I'd probably lean more towards looking at the high performers. Because taking on that role is quite challenging, and I say that too with a bit of caution because just because you're a high performer doesn't mean you're a caregiver. But if you're a high performer, perhaps you're more likely to be a caregiver if you kind of fall within that sandwich generation. You also said mid-career as well, right? Like mid-career is, what, 40s to early 50s. And if you
Mhm.
think about you have your parents on one side, and if you do have kids are on the other side, you're caught in between. So now you have kind of two pulling forces that are taking away from your ability to fully immerse yourself into your job. And that's only problematic for an organization and the individual
Mhm.
themselves, balancing those two.
Absolutely. And honestly, that is a huge impact on the organization itself. What that looks like can be different for each organization, but it comes with increased absenteeism. So the employee is there physically, but maybe mentally they're not fully there, obviously increase or disrupting that productivity. And then network shrinkage at work, reduced informal engagement. You're totally checked out sometimes because something happens and you still have to show up to work. And you still
Hmm.
have to be present for those meetings or presentations or even conferences, whatever it may be. You still have to show up, but your brain can be totally somewhere else and
Yeah,
increases
yeah,
brain fog completely. And
yeah,
honestly, that also affects um, development in your own career because sure, you have a lot going on yourself, whatever it may be, but your manager, your boss, whoever it is, they see that and they might not necessarily see it for what it actually is. They might just see, oh, you're underperforming at work, you're not mentally all there. Oftentimes, the employer or the boss, manager, whatever it is, overlooking you, they won't look at you for, oh, maybe they have a lot going on in their life. Maybe they're caring for their aging parent. Maybe they have to juggle that with caring for their kids. They just look at it for what it is, as you're not producing at work. You're not showing up to work.
right. Absolutely. And as we know, women are the ones that get impacted the most. They're
Hmm.
typically the go-to people when it comes to caregiving. It's just, perhaps what it is. And so you're right. How does it impact that individual's career? What does it look like when it kind of plays out? For women, definitely, off the top of my head, I can't think of the resource or the reference, but women are not advancing in their career as much as they did, say, 10, 15 years ago because of this very thing. And that's problematic from an organizational perspective because you're missing out on that talent. Not because they don't want to be there, but their lives are split between, their work and what's happening in their life, especially if they're a caregiver on both sides, the children and the parents, perhaps. Absenteeism is one thing. That's an obvious kind of way of tracking what's going on, how often somebody, is not coming to work. But I think what's worse and what's common in the field is presenteeism, just being there but not, being
Hmm.
engaged or being able to focus in on that. I know from a personal perspective, when I'm involved in a project and then I come home and I'm talking to my wife or my children, yeah, yeah, they're talking to me, but I'm not fully there because I'm totally engaged or immersed in what I'm doing on the project. So you can only imagine coming to work. And this is, from a productivity perspective, very challenging for organizations. We know
Hmm.
in Canada, across the G7, Canada has one of the lowest, productive workforces out there. And this is accounting for a bit of caregiving, unpaid caregivers, but it's only increasing in light of the fact that our, aging population and so forth. So organizations need to kind of take a look at this and recognize that it's going to impact the way that they run their organization. It's quite significant, and how they deal with it is going to determine, whether or not they could stabilize it to some degree, but definitely a challenge. And when it comes to managing a workforce, making sure that that workforce is helping the organization achieve their strategical objectives, is at the forefront of any workforce development initiative. And when you have that caregiver who is being distracted for good reasons, for the reality, human nature, you could say, oh, you got to separate, your personal life from your work life. That's just not reality.
Hmm.
So recognizing that is kind of the first step towards an organization figuring out what are the best strategies to deal with it and what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is hard for organizations to monitor. Sometimes maybe they feel personal lives are personal lives. It's hard to jump in and say, hey, what's going on in your personal life? Because you don't always feel connected to share with a coworker or someone at work, your boss. Um, So that could be a huge reason as to why organizations aren't monitoring. It's uncomfortable to ask for managers. And I mean, caregiver stress is masked as performance decline, right? So, like I said previously or earlier, is there's not always that dive deeper into why there's performance decline. It's more of a, well, you're not doing your job, not a why aren't you doing your job? So I think that if organizations can monitor that better, ideally we can move into a brighter future for the working caregiver. Um, there's a lack of formal disclosure mechanisms, and no structured metric in HR dashboards either. So it's very hard to measure, in general. It's a very vague, very personal to each individual, and it can look different for everyone too, what they're dealing with, how they have to juggle everything. It's hard, and I think that does come down to managers having to know their people. Obviously, responding to each person differently and knowing their personality type is really important and what they need. I think that's huge,
Mhm.
but easier said than done, of
Right.
course.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like you said, when you're talking about managers, it's a leadership kind of issue. Um, and what does that organization invest into their leadership? What sort of leadership development programs do they have in place for those existing leaders? What do they look like when they, hire new leaders and so forth?
Hmm.
And, the reality is, anything that is measured is deemed important. And so if you're not monitoring for the reality of what's happening in typical society in their employees' lives, you're not going to find that important. So it becomes really critical to be able to do that. But I think, like you said, how do you monitor whether or not somebody has anxiety or is being stressed out because they're taking care of, their father who woke up in the middle of the night and they had to drive over and, deal with a particular issue, right? It's that kind of unseen challenge or anxiety that employee is experiencing. So, it's not as obvious as other things that are impacting. You could even say childcare is more obvious because kids say, "Well, I couldn't make it in," or kids, the employee says, "I couldn't make it in because I was dealing with my kid or whatever it is," but they may never talk about, more of stressful situations with their parents, say, for example,
Hmm.
or experience dementia or other kind of ailments and so forth. So it becomes a real challenge. And like you said about leadership or supervisors, it may be an uncomfortable kind of conversation to have. And, in my experience, when you see, an employee underperforming, it really becomes a conversation and kind of finding what's, the root versus the kind of symptoms. We know what the symptoms are because we can see that. Well, they're not, they're not showing up on time or their work is not up to par. But what's causing those types of issues? And that takes a leader who's really self-aware and understands what potentially could be going on and explores, performance related issues that are happening. So, you know, I think organizations are attempting to monitor it, but they can't narrow down specifically on what they need to monitor. There's no registry or, they're not collecting information as to whether or not, an employee has a 70-year-old and an 80-year-old parent, or if they have young children and so forth. And that becomes really important. And I think because of that, many organizations have EAP in place, which is employee assistance programs, and those are underutilized. And so there's definitely a correlation between or a link between not monitoring and utilizing the resources that they pay for to implement. Because if you monitor it, it becomes more important and you look for solutions. And an EAP definitely is something that can help with that. So again, organizations, are they under monitoring what the situation is? I think so, because it's such a challenging thing. It's not a new thing, but it's a challenging thing to kind of nail down. And it comes from, like you said, the leadership development side, but it also comes from, putting metrics on the dashboard that they can actually look to see whether or not they're in a position to move forward in a positive way.
Exactly. And I do sometimes think that when you have young kids, it's expected that maybe you're gonna call in sick because your child is sick, you have to care for them, things like that. But it's not often expected that you're gonna have to call in sick because you have to care for your parent. It's just not something that's widely talked about, and it's gonna become more prominent with the aging population for sure. So I think organizations need to start normalizing these conversations in their workplace. It's I mean, very important as we know, but it's these conversations need to start being had and including caregiving surveys or engagement surveys so you can sort of dive deeper into what that looks like if they have young kids, if they have aging parents, so you can sort of start those conversations meaningfully, maybe have a little more empathy for those who do have those kids and those aging parents. And then I think a big thing for the organization would be to train managers to recognize those patterns, but to also then approach properly.
Well,
So
I wonder what would those conversations look like? Like, hey, you kind of see somebody stressed out at work. They're typically not performing like they normally do. What's the practicality of sitting down and going, hey, what's going on? How challenging can that be, if at all?
I think it can be very challenging depending on the person you are too, but I think it starts with a simple, how are you doing? Or like, are you okay? Because oftentimes you get a, hey, how are you? And the automatic response is, good, how are you?
Mhm.
But does
Mhm.
anybody actually like take a second and think about how they're doing before responding? And then think about if you ask me how I'm doing and I responded, I'm actually not having a great day, but thank you for asking. Imagine your response to that. You're used to the standard, good, thanks, how are you? So I think sitting down with someone and just trying to dive deeper into how they're actually doing is a great conversation starter. And approaching that with compassion and empathy and showing that you actually do care. Because as a manager, you should actually care about your employees.
Right. Absolutely. You would think.
You would think, you would
You
hope.
would think. You would hope. Yeah.
So, and then again, I guess using those engagement surveys
Hmm.
to see sort of what they have going on. I wouldn't use them necessarily too much against them almost, but
Right.
definitely to ease them into a conversation to know that it's a safe space that they can speak about what's going on, and then realizing that life is hard and even giving them a break. Like,
Right.
I know that's hard as an organization, you have things to get done, whatever it may be, but realizing that if you care for the person, if you care for the employee down the line or wherever it may be, they're going to be more productive if they feel cared for, if they feel like it's a safe space for them to express their emotions professionally, obviously, but the more you nurture that relationship in the workplace, the better they're going to perform.
Yeah. Potentially. Yeah, for sure. I see that. And the reality is this. There's a fine line between our professional lives and our personal lives. And society and the organization. Organizations are, a reflection of society. Society is a reflection of our organizations. You can't separate those two. It comes down to culture, values, and so forth. Those vary and differ between organizations, but in general, they're a reflection of each other. And if anybody out there is aware that, hey, we have an aging population, right? That people are getting older, that, the Ontario government has an aging at home, that, that's the objective. So we want to make sure. We realize that what is it? Over 4.3 million Canadians are unpaid caregivers. They're the core of the system. They're quintessential to the success of aging in place and all those types of things. And if that's happening in our communities and in our towns and our cities, it's happening in our organization. So one, recognizing that it's not a huge leap to think that these things are happening. So becoming aware. And
Absolutely.
that comes like we talked about, from a leadership perspective, like, how are you developing your leaders? How is the organization developing them? How are they hiring them? What are they looking for? And so forth. And I think you know, it seems so simple on the surface, but once we kind of delve into things, it becomes a lot more complex. There's many issues going on. It's multi-factored, multivariate, and so forth. And recognizing that, I think that is key. And as you said earlier on, having these conversations, not only from me to, an employee or subordinate, but amongst management saying, okay, like let's be real here. Work-life balance. We know it's on trend and it's been around for a little bit, and we're trying to find a balance between that. What's actually happening out there in society, in the communities, and so forth, and how is that impacting us? And I think a responsible organization takes that approach, and they understand and they recognize that we're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with human nature. I think 9 times out of 10, people are going to choose their family over the career. Maybe less, maybe more. I don't know, but I think so. And that's not a bad thing, right? Organizations want those high performers, those committed individuals to what the company is trying to accomplish. But is that realistic, right?
Right.
And perhaps it's not. So I think that responsible organization is recognizing that we're dealing with human beings. They're stretched very thin. There's a lot of demands societally and personally, and that's going to come over into the organization. So making sure that they have in place mechanisms that support that notion. And I know we're not going to delve in, we'll leave that for a later conversation in terms of what organizations can actually do. But I think before you get to that stage, before an organization gets to that stage, they recognize that this is happening. And I think that acceptance that it is happening opens up for opportunities to figure out what can be done to kind of support so that at least things can become stabilized. Organizations will never eliminate this problem ever, right? Ever. And that's the unfortunate part. If we could snap our fingers or wave a magical wand, that would be ideal. But, recognizing that it's happening, recognizing that, everybody's different, they're unique, they're individuals, but making sure that that mechanisms are in place that support them, the employee, so that when this does happen, they're able to find a balance between what's happening in their life and what's happening on the job.
Absolutely. And what do you think those mechanisms would look like?
Yeah, and it varies, and it's already out there. EAPs, right?
Yeah.
Employee assistance programs. They have navigation tools. I think perhaps, and us coming from Caredara, we're all at that activation layer where we put people right in their homes. But there's a number of programs that they can put in place to do that, and which are formal mechanisms, right? And it's slowly more and more happening. And I think we just talked about what makes an effective organization in dealing with this is those that are willing to implement these mechanisms. And I think, the US is probably much more further ahead than we are, larger population, perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. Canada is kind of moving towards that, but there are some formal mechanisms. But as you talked about, there's also some informal mechanisms that they can put in place, like leadership development, making sure supervisors, managers are having those conversations, making sure that they are conducting kind of check-ins or surveys to see where employees are at, looking at the demographic profile of the workforce. If you tend to have between 40 and 50-year-olds, you're more likely to have that sandwich generation taking care of parents as well as the kids. So there's a number of informal mechanisms that could be put in place to really, address this issue, monitor it, and then move towards implementing some these solutions. But definitely something we're going to chat about in the future
Hmm.
podcast episodes. But again, recognition, understanding what's going on, setting up a monitoring, knowing that what we measure is important, and all those types of things is absolutely critical.
Hmm. Absolutely. And the reality is that this is this is how it's going to be. Unfortunately, that's the direction that we're moving is there's going to be employees who are caregivers, those high performers, they're going to have to step away and care for their parent or whatever it may be during work hour, take a hospital phone call, maybe be mentally checked out. And the question is, are organizations ready and prepared for this happening? Because it is already happening, but how can they better prepare as the population ages?
Right. And if organizations want to win the talent war or whatever you want to call it, being prepared, like you just said, is absolutely key. And it's I think it's human nature to kind of suppress or ignore things that are happening in our lives that are, that are challenges. And I think organizations are the same way. And it takes a strong leadership. It takes a culture that kind of supports that, but it's just the reality. And those organizations that are prepared and recognize it are those that are going to be sustainable over the long run. Those that ignore it are going to have a heck of a long. I was going to say long road, maybe short road,
Yeah.
before something critically happens and negatively happens to them. So absolutely, I think
Right.
the first step is recognizing that this issue exists. How are we monitoring it? And then think about the mechanisms in terms of how we can, support those employees who are caregivers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we've chatted all that we can
Mhm.
today before diving deeper into those mechanisms. We definitely will in the future, in future episodes or yeah, episodes, future podcasts.
Yes.
So I'll leave it with caregiving is not a fringe issue, it's a workforce reality. So organizations are already feeling it. There's absenteeism, presenteeism, turnover, high rate of burnout. They're just not putting a title on it. They're not naming it. So tracking caregiving isn't intrusive, it's strategic. Knowing your people, knowing what's going on inside your organization is really important. And that does start with those organizations trickling down into managers and employees. So the question isn't whether your organization is prepared for what that means, or the question is whether your organization is prepared for what that means. If you're leading people, caregiving is already a part of your organization. It's already intertwined. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
All
So it's
right,
a
cool.
lot. We care. Thank you for listening today, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope this conversation gave you something to think about, whether you're leading a team, supporting employees, or navigating care in your own life. If it resonated with you, know that you are not alone. Caregiving is a part of how we live and work, even if we don't always talk about it. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like us on Facebook at Caredara, follow us on Instagram at Caredara app, and connect with us on LinkedIn at Caredara to stay up to date and join the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just say hi. And don't forget, new episodes coming soon. If you want to take action on today's conversation, scan the QR code in the bottom left to plan for readiness, access helpful resources, and stay prepared. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care, and remember, you are not alone in this.